Great.
Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. Let me tell our audience that it is a real honor to have this speaker tonight. I mean, Jonathan Turley is one of the most renowned lawyers and legal scholars in the country, and he's spoken for FFF before, and it's just we're very, very grateful that you would take the time to do this. I know you just had a class that you taught at George Washington. Professor Turley teaches at George Washington. He's been part of the faculty there since 1990. He started out teaching at Tulane Law School. In 1998, he became the youngest chaired professor in George Washington Law School's history. He's the founder and executive director of the Project for Older Prisoners, or POPs. He's written for all kinds of academic legal journals, including those of Cornell, Duke, Georgetown, Harvard, Northwestern universities, and others. He has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases in the country in the last 2 decades. I'll just mention a couple: a representation of the Area 51 workers at a secret air base in Nevada. He represented 4 former U.S. attorney generals during the Clinton impeachment litigation. He has served as counsel in a variety of national security and terrorism cases. He's been ranked as one of the top 10 lawyers in the country handling military cases. He has served as a consultant on Homeland Security and constitutional issues, a frequent witness before the House and Senate on constitutional and statutory issues, as well as on tort reform legislation. He's a nationally recognized legal commentator. He ranked 38th in the top 100 of the most cited public intellectuals in a recent study by Judge Richard Posner, and he's found to be the second most cited law professor in the country. He's a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors and a recipient of the 2005 Single Issue Advocate of the Year, the Annual Opinion Award for the Aspen Institute, and the Week magazine. His articles have appeared in all sorts of national newspapers. In fact, more than 400 of his articles have appeared in the mainstream press. So it's a great honor and a privilege to have you join us, and a pleasure. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for that very kind introduction. And I'm going to try to do something for the technologically inept, which I am. So this may be a disaster, but I'm going to try to share a screen with everyone. And it looks like it actually worked. Can you see the screen? I hope. I think so, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about what I see as a trend, both in the United States and abroad, in the erosion of free speech. And I'm going to run through a bunch of slides to give you some of the history, but then the direction in which free speech seems to be going in our country, which is not in a good direction. Of course, when we talk about constitutional rights, we start with England and the Magna Carta. Although I'm not a big fan of the Magna Carta. I was actually invited to speak on a panel at the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, which was sort of funny because Magna Carta, in my view, is routinely misunderstood. It was largely a failure, not recognized by the king. But it actually enforced a series of civil limitations on free speech that we would find obnoxious today. England itself treats speech as a privilege. It took a different approach to free speech than we did. In some ways, England is based on a concept of almost benign government that while it doesn't have as many express rights, it enjoys freedom because its government has long been benign and recognized the need to continue those freedoms. The rights themselves are statutorily based so that no parliament can bind its successors. And you also had this history in England of free speech which was really quite obnoxious, as the Lord Chief Justice John Holt said in 1704, that it didn't extend to protections against criticizing the government, which is really quite odd when you think about it. For it's the very necessary for all governments that people should have a good opinion of it. It's a really offensive and bizarre way to talk about free speech, particularly in a country that has it as a privilege. That approach would prove the undoing of free speech in England. Free speech is in a free fall in the United Kingdom and in many European countries, as they have enacted laws that have criminalized speech for criticism or stereotyping of others and other groups. And the cases go from the bizarre to the chilling. You had a person who was arrested for an anti-police t-shirt. Home Secretary Amber Rudd was accused of a hate crime for simply saying that foreign workers were taking jobs from British citizens. A person was arrested for a Mandela joke. A preacher was arrested for calling homosexuality a sin. A teenager was put in custody for holding up a sign saying Scientology is a cult. All of these things were viewed as hate speech. And once England, like other countries, started to criminalize speech and declare certain things to be hate speech, it became an insatiable appetite. And every group then insisted that it also be included in criminalizing the speech of others. So today, many people in England spend more time trying to silence other speakers than they do responding to them, in my view. The chilling effect in European countries is quite clear. In Germany, England, France, these hate crimes have become more and more expansive. A recent poll in Germany found only 18% of Germans felt free to express their views in public. And what's really interesting is that 33% of Germans didn't feel comfortable expressing themselves in private among friends. And only 17% felt comfortable speaking freely on the internet. That is called the chilling effect that US courts have long sought to avoid. It's not just that the government will arrest you for speech, although that's certainly happening in Europe. It is the chilling effect that you might be accused of a crime or identified in this way. The United States took a different approach, and we were benefited from having people like Thomas Paine, who was a true Paine. People really disliked Thomas Paine. He was, in my view, one of the most rich and wonderful characters of the Revolution. He couldn't go into a pub without starting a fight. I mean, he just loved to tell people things they didn't want to hear. One of the people that hated him the most was John Adams, and that makes a lot of sense given John Adams' horrific use of the Alien and Sedition Acts against free speech. It's not surprising that Thomas Paine was the focus of his ire. He called him a crapulous mass. And even Thomas Paine even irritated the French. He went over there before the Revolution, and the French embraced this wonderful American revolutionary figure. And then he started to say things to them that they didn't like. He couldn't help it. And he constantly was being threatened with arrest, eventually was imprisoned by Robespierre, because Thomas Paine was the embodiment of free speech and the free press. Now, the United States has a remarkable sentence in the Constitution, and it's beautiful in its simplicity. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, period. Now, that model of clarity seems to have escaped many in our society. But people like Louis Brandeis talked about freedom of speech as the indispensable freedom. It is the way that you discover and spread political truth. I'm particularly fond of Hugo Black, who said in an opinion, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging. And for those of us in the free speech community, there is much truth to that statement. So many people talk about how, when people like me come to Capitol Hill to testify about free speech or constitutional rights, they say that's a very dated notion, that the framers didn't experience what we're experiencing in this age of rage. It's all an incredibly ill-informed view of the Constitution. The Constitution wasn't just written for times like ours. It was written during a time like ours. When politicians today say that the other side talks like they want to kill you, well, back then they were actually trying to kill each other, the Federalists and Jeffersonians. A Federalist newspaper warned that electing Jefferson would lead to a virtual apocalypse of murder, robbery, rape, adultery, incest will be practiced openly, taught and practiced, and the air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. I mean, that's even, that even makes some of our current editorials look tame in comparison. Jefferson referred to the Federalists as the reign of the witches. So these people wrote a document not just for, but during a time like these. Now, of course, John Adams, in my view, will forever be besmirched by his legacy of the use of the Alien and Sedition Acts, where he imprisoned people for the crime to print, utter, publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government of the United States or Congress or the president. It sounds much like the quote I read you from the 1700s in England. And Adams is stating the very same flawed and frankly horrific view of free speech. And so he did arrest those who wrote criticisms of him. Callender, for example, one of the most famous cases, called him a repulsive, pedant, and gross hypocrite and an unprincipled oppressor. That could actually satisfy the standard for defamation of the defense of truth. If you look at what Adams was doing at the time, various people were arrested, including a member of Congress who was arrested for simply speaking out against the president. To his credit, Thomas Jefferson made sure that the Sedition Act would not be brought back. It expired with Adams, which is quite fitting. And he warned against new pretexts for those who wish it to be believed that a man cannot be governed but by a rod of iron. So we have often struggled with our commitment to free speech. Of course, the Red Scare from 1917 to 1920 was one of our low points, where we gathered up communists and others, including anarchists. The Attorney General at that time said, "May God have mercy on them, for they need expect none from an outraged people and an avenging government." These were people being arrested, often simply for their views and their criticism of the government. It was during this time that Oliver Wendell Holmes said one of the most unfortunate things ever printed in a opinion, when he said the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic, in the Schenck case. He would come to regret that statement, which has been widely misused. It is often used to defend censorship. It's used today to defend the expanding censorship on the internet. Holmes himself ended up rejecting that standard. He ended up showing buyer's remorse. He dissented to Adams in the use of the clear and present danger standard. And that the court rejected that standard in Brandenburg. But nobody mentions that. They just simply constantly quote Holmes for suggesting that free speech can be limited just like it is for someone screaming fire in a crowded theater. People have made mockery of it, including the Chicago 7 and Hoffman saying that free speech means the right to shout theater in a crowded fire. But the problem is that it is a mantra used by those who want us to embrace censorship. And of course, we had a second Red Scare that involved the Un-American Activities Committee in the blacklisting of artists. And one of the reasons I raise this is because we are living through that period again. Ironically, people during that period were leftists who were put on blacklists and kept from employment. Now it's the left that is creating blacklists and trying to bar people from publications and from jobs and from speaking opportunities. The script has flipped. Those that were oppressed are now the oppressors in many of these cases, which is a terrible judgment that one has to make on our current times. So we see this happening with people arguing for censorship on the internet. It's no accident that countries like Russia and China have spent all the time since the creation of the internet trying to control it, because they recognize the internet as a terrible threat to authoritarianism. The internet is the greatest single creation for free speech since the printing press. And it could topple governments, and they knew it. And so they have tried just to censor the internet continually. What is alarming is it's now American leaders, including President Biden, who are pushing for censorship on the internet to kill the very thing that these totalitarian countries fear, the only thing they fear. An example of that is that we have a different form of censorship. That in countries like China, you have a Ministry of Information, a censorship agency. In the United States, we've seen that you can have the same state media without the state, that the media can collectively assign the proper narrative in framing news stories. That was evident in the Hunter Biden story, one of the most outrageous chapters in American media, where Twitter not only banned stories about the laptop of Hunter Biden, but the media cooperated entirely in making the scandal disappear. This is a scandal in which the incoming president, the person running for president, was accused, his entire family was accused of influence peddling. His son, his brother, he's directly referenced in these emails. You have critical people who were recipients of these emails saying that they, in the case of Bublinsky, saying that they had a meeting with Joe Biden. The fact that this scandal was made to disappear is one of the most shocking developments I've seen in my lifetime in the free press. It is sort of like when Houdini made Jenny the elephant disappear as his main act. The key is that she didn't disappear. She was always on the stage, but people didn't want to see her. And that's what happened in this case. The Bidens made an entire scandal disappear in front of an audience of millions. And they did it by essentially inviting the audience to the stage, the media, making them part of this trick. And so you can have a media, a state media, without the state. And the loss is with free speech. The moment that I knew that we were going to have a crisis of free speech was when the New York Times apologized for running the editorial of Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton had written an editorial about the use of National Guard troops to quell further unrest in Washington. The irony, of course, is that when the Capitol was the subject of a riot, they not only put up the same fencing that was denounced in Lafayette Park, but they called out the National Guard, the very thing that Cotton was talking about. But the New York Times apologized, effectively fired the editor, and promised that they wouldn't run anything like that again. In the meantime, they ran the IP column by a Hong Kong official called Beijing's Enforcer, where she dismissed protesters fighting for freedom and celebrated the crushing of demonstrators. They published a professor at the University of Rhode Island who has said that he has no problem with killing Republican and conservative counter-protesters, including one that was actually killed at the hands of protesters. So the Times is not just hypocritical, but this represented what would ultimately haunt the media, the beginning of what's called advocacy journalism, where journalists actively shape the narrative. They educate readers as to what's the proper view, and they call everything else disinformation. You even have law professor Jack Goldsmith and Professor Andrew Keen Woods writing an editorial saying that China was right about censorship, that we need to embrace censorship on the internet, and we were wrong all along to embrace free speech. That is a view now embraced by many. The dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, one of the most prestigious schools of journalism, complained about the weaponization of free speech and calling for measures to keep harmful speech off the internet and disinformation from being seen by those who are unwitting victims. So we have to choose between someone like Mao and Mill. In Mill, his standard for proper government conduct was to prevent harm for others. It's called the harm principle. And in that harm was not speech. You couldn't be harmed under Mill's view by the speech of others. Many people in academia and on Capitol Hill have flipped that position. They now call free speech itself harmful. And it must be contained, it must be controlled, it must be censored. We see in polls that there's a rising generation of censors, that 40% of millennials favor speech codes and government sanctions. There's a rising number of people that support censorship on the internet, but only for things that they consider to be disinformation. In a recent recent Senate hearing, you had the tech executives appearing before the Senate, and the Twitter CEO actually apologized for blocking any discussion of the Hunter Biden laptop until after the election. The response from the Democratic senators was quite astonishing. They pushed back and said that they don't want any backsliding on censorship, what Senator Blumenthal called robust content modification, which is the Orwellian term for censorship. And they insisted that they expand those areas being censored, not just to involve election fraud, but climate change and gender issues, and wanted them to pledge that they would not reduce, but expand their level of censorship. Academics have said the same thing. Professor Marianne Franks said that the internet model of free speech is little more than a cacophony where the loudest and most provocative and most unlikable voice dominates. She says, if we want to protect speech, we should not only resist the attempt to remake college campuses in the image of the internet, but to consider the benefits of making the internet the image of the university. What she's talking about is speech codes. When she talks about this cacophony of unlikable voices, they're voices that she doesn't like, that she disagrees with. And that's unacceptable, much like the professors that said that China was right, that the way that we should do this is to silence these voices, so that the only voices you hear speak the truth that is defined by professors like Professor Franks. So the model that she's talking about are these vague speech codes. At Penn State, bars any speech that can be viewed as taunting or ridiculing. You have Texas A&M saying speech can be barred that doesn't respect personal feelings. In Rhode Island College, it's to punish attitudes that are considered inappropriate. Harassment is derogatory comments or remarks that may be said. Now, one of the important aspects of this is these are all very subjective. They're how speech is received rather than intended. Now, the courts have actually been quite consistent in saying that for public universities, these violate the First Amendment, but universities are not backing down. They are going further and further in the restriction of free speech. And they've included microaggressions that are not directly hate speech, but are considered hateful, using terms like America's the land of opportunity, or don't take things so seriously is considered a microaggression. Even statements made outside of schools are punished. A Yale dean was punished for giving a bad Yelp review to a Japanese steakhouse, which was considered a classist critique, and so she was canned as the dean at Yale. Northwestern students stopped a class involving an INS official who was invited after an undocumented person was asked into the class to talk about her life. The teacher had a good idea of calling an INS person or an ICE person to talk about why she does what she does. Students blocked anyone from going into the classroom, and the dean of students appeared and ordered that the students be allowed into the classroom as long as they promised not to interrupt it, which of course they went in and immediately started screaming profanities and not allowing the class to continue. And what's really interesting is that these students then gave interviews to the newspaper under their real names. They were not afraid to admit that they stopped a class from occurring because they didn't like what the teacher was teaching. April Navarro, one of the students, said that she wasn't going to let some good, nice conversation occur when ICE is terrorizing communities. And she notably said, we're not interested in having those types of conversations that would be like, oh, let's listen to their side of it. Her intention and those of the other students was to stop others from hearing opposing views. And she succeeded. None of those students were punished. None of the students were punished by Northwestern. On campus, conservatives, of course, have been prevented from speaking. This is often done at places like DePaul, where they simply say that it's canceled over security concerns. Students at Georgetown Law School stopped the Homeland Security Secretary from speaking. At Howard, James Comey was prevented from speaking because they did not want others to hear what they might have to say. And you see the support for this in the media, that the media supports chastising and barring conservatives, including Nick Sandmann, who was falsely accused of abusing a Native American in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And yet an assistant professor promised to closely monitor his movements around the campus when he was accepted for admission. This is a professor talking about a student who received settlements from these newspapers because he was falsely accused. She knew that, and yet she promised that he would be followed and monitored wherever he might go, or at least monitored on campus, whatever that must mean. Part of this movement is a quite dangerous element, which is Antifa. I testified in the Senate on Antifa. I've written academic pieces. I have another piece coming out in Harvard talking about Antifa in one of the Harvard journals. This was a creation during World War II. It's an anti-racist action, anti-fascist group. But at the heart of Antifa is an anti-free speech commitment. It is part of their core values. So Antifa starts out with a quote about fascism is not to be debated, it's to be destroyed. And anti-fascists don't oppose fascism because it's a liberal. This is the author of the Antifa handbook. In the abstract, it's because it promotes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ultra-nationalism, authoritarianism, and genocide. All those things are considered fascism. All those things are considered things that you have to stop from other people hearing such viewpoints. The Antifa handbook expressly rejects the allegiance to liberal democracy and to free speech. And the purpose of the movement is to, quote, end their politics. And they do that through no platforming, which is stopping people from being heard on campus. And this is the ultimate of the heckler's veto. At Rice University, I had a debate with NYU professor Jeremy Walden, who's a big supporter of speech codes. And he supports the heckler's veto, that to go into events and prevent others from hearing a speaker is a form of free speech. It's not a form of free speech. Stopping people from speaking in an event like this is not free speech. Now, you can protest outside. You can be heard as much as you want outside. But unfortunately, academics have treated the stopping of others as a form of free speech. That includes the CNA, the CUNY law dean, Mary Lou Billick, who said that shutting down speakers is an act of free speech. She recently canceled herself because she made a comment in a faculty meeting that was considered insensitive, and so she effectively fired herself. In William and Mary, you had protesters screaming liberalism is white supremacy and opposing an ACLU lawyer from speaking about free speech, saying ACLU, you protect Hitler too. And students are picking up on this. In Wellesley, the students said shutting down rhetoric that undermines the existence and rights of others is not a violation of free speech. It is free speech, a view that an increasing number of students support. After the killing of Aaron J. Donaldson, you had Professor Loomis at Rhode Island saying that sometimes violence is necessary and saying that he was okay with these acts of violence. In Santa Barbara, a University of California teacher led her class out to attack a pro-life display, breaking down the display and committing assault against those that were there to talk about pro-life. The faculty and students overwhelmingly supported Miller Young. She was not punished at the university, even though she confessed to criminal assault. She was not fired or disciplined for engaging in a criminal assault on campus, leading members of her class. We've seen attacks on many academics. The way that this is done is a rejection of what's called both sides rhetoric, which is basically just saying that we will no longer accept the other side of arguments to be heard. That's treated as both sidism. It's a bizarrely ridiculous term for silencing the other side of an argument. Journalists have now picked this up. There was a recent editorial in the LA Times saying that journalists should reject both sidism and stop reporting the other side of many of these stories, because the other side, the conservatives or Republicans, are simply wrong. And so you shouldn't even give credence to the opposing view. We've had students who have been punished. And in one case in Georgetown University, a student was given a formal reprimand because he published a column off campus that questioned some of views with regard to police misconduct and some of the protests that were occurring. Student newspapers have dismissed columnists who have opposed defunding police, and just because those views are no longer tolerated. Now, let me finish by saying that at George Washington, we have some of these same figures who have opposed free speech. One of them is a student by the name of Jason Charter, who was arrested leading an effort to topple statues in Washington, D.C. And he is someone associated with Antifa. After he was arrested, he said something that's quite telling. He simply tweeted out, "The movement is winning." And he's right. The movement is winning. It's winning because people are afraid, people are silenced. I've never in my career seen faculty more afraid. They're afraid of being tagged as racist or insensitive. They're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of losing opportunities to publish or to speak. What these groups are doing in the anti-free speech movement is to take away everything an academic needs for a full intellectual life. Few faculty are willing to risk that. And so there's silence. They are winning because that's the point of no platforming, of targeting of academics and other individuals. It's to intimidate them into silence so that people can't hear the other side. They can't hear the opposing view. Now, this is a very depressing sort of rendition of where we are. But that's the magic of the Constitution. We have a system that is self-correcting. We have the ability to turn this around. Free speech, more than any value, defines us as a people. But every generation has to renew that commitment and has to fight for every inch of our freedoms. And they do that by educating people, by standing up and saying they won't be silenced, by not being intimidated. And it's not easy. Most faculty in this country have failed that task, I'm sorry to say. Free speech is dying on our campuses, but it doesn't have to die in this country. We remain the bastion of free speech in the world, and we shouldn't let others say that China is right or free speech is harmful. We need to say that the Constitution itself is a type of article of faith. It requires every generation to have a type of leap of faith. We're living in a time of a crisis of faith. We have to help fellow citizens regain that faith, not by threatening them, not by yelling at them, but to try to educate them that free speech helps us all, but it requires a bright line to survive. It requires us all to take that leap of faith together. So why don't I stop there? And then if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I can try to make this disappear if I can do it right. Let's see here.
Jonathan, at the top of the screen, there you go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Johnson, for that excellent summary and analysis and rendition of where we are in this country with respect to this critically important civil liberty. Let me begin by asking you, what do you attribute this trend to? I mean, what do you think the root causes of this are? Why have Americans decided to go off in this direction? And how long has this trend been going on?
Well, the trend has been going on for a while. You know, when we had the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France, they had that march in favor of free speech. And one of the surviving editors refused to go. And he said he wanted to throw up because it had all these world leaders from Turkey, Germany, who have led the crackdown on the media and free speech, marching in this showing of unity. And as soon as that day ended, they returned to prohibiting forms of free speech. I think that people, in some ways, this is the corruption of power. You know, we see it on universities. You know, liberal faculty reached a critical mass. I consider myself socially quite liberal. I was considered a liberal faculty member until recently, but I also believe very strongly in free speech. I often would try to get academics on faculties against more conservative objections. But after we reach this tipping point, there's been virtually a cleansing of every faculty of conservative members, particularly in law school. It is often common to have only one or two conservatives or libertarians on faculties. It is an orthodoxy that has taken hold, and it comes from power. It's getting the power to silence others. People find that easier than to answer people, right? You don't want to, it takes a lot of time to try to convince someone or win a debate. It's so much easier to ban them, to censor them, or to intimidate them.
Well, when I was practicing law many, many years ago, I practiced law for about 12 years. And one of the principles that had such a profound effect on me was when the ACLU defended the right of Nazis to protest in Skokie, Illinois. And that's when it really hit me that free speech is really the protection of speech that you hate, that you despise. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, and that's what the interesting about the Antifa movement is because they reject that notion. And many faculty today expressly reject the notion that free speech is its own corrective element, that good speech will crowd out bad speech. That's at the heart of this sort of classical view of free speech. I happen to still be a dinosaur who believes in that. But that is rejected now by many faculty, many law professors, many people in Congress, that they don't believe that you should fight for people who are telling things that are not true, that are disinformation, which is the new term. You just say that people that you disagree with are spreading disinformation about COVID or about elections or about equal rights. And you see how insatiable that appetite is, right? It started out in the internet by barring certain areas, narrow areas like threats and other things. But then as soon as people found out that they could ban people simply because they find their views insulting, it became a snowball effect. So now Twitter, Facebook, and other companies have the largest censorship programs in the history of the world. And there are calls for more censorship on Capitol Hill. I don't know what happened to the Democratic Party. I was raised in a liberal Democratic family. Free speech used to be the touchstone of the party. Now, Democrats seem to be united around censorship. I've never thought I would see that day.
All right, let's turn to our audience questions. We have a few. Do the young editors you deal with at newspapers and websites have the same gut instinct support for free speech now as did the older editors you dealt with 15 or 20 years ago?
The answer is no, because many editors, I write for the various newspapers and I'm very happy with my editors, but there are many editors who are part of this woke movement. They had a cleansing at the New York Times. They have embraced advocacy journalism. At NPR, they crossed the Rubicon by announcing that their journalists will now be allowed to participate in protests. That was always a touchstone of journalism, that journalists had to stay out of politics and protest. NPR said, no, we're going to now allow journalists to be protesters. So instead of advocacy journalism, they'll just be advocates. And what's fascinating is that NPR says, but only for causes we approve, causes that we consider to be advancing human rights. There was a time when a statement like that would have been ridiculed by every living journalist. But today that is considered to be the norm.
Okay, another question. During the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, a prime effort was to capture the universities for the Nazis. Would you discuss any parallels to what is happening on campuses today, both in the United States and in Europe?
Well, we certainly have a great deal of intolerance that we see throughout these periods. I think actually the closest analogy is to the McCarthy period. It is really quite ironic. It would be humorous if it wasn't so tragic that in the McCarthy period, all these movies are written about people who fought blacklists, who bravely refused to yield to threats, even though they couldn't write movies or act anymore. And they're right. These figures were worthy of praise, the ones that refused to back down to McCarthy. But now it's the left that is embracing blacklists. There are journalists who've written columns calling for conservatives to be barred from books, for books written by them to be barred from bookstores. In Canada recently, there was an actual book burning by the school district for students to celebrate their sort of new woke policy. They actually burned books and taught the children that that was correct. So you have this incredible flipping where now that the left has greater power, they are turning on the right and doing many of the same things that happened during the McCarthy period.
Okay, let me ask you my own personal question again. Do you think that the post 9/11 environment had any effect on this movement towards suppression free speech, or you think that's just something totally independent?
Well, this was developing in Europe before 9/11. Germany, of course, always had limitations on speech. They eliminated symbols of the Nazi regime and materials connected to the Nazi regime. And I can understand, given the pain and the horrific outcome of World War II, why they felt that need. But it is worth noting that it didn't work. I mean, all of those criminal laws in Germany didn't stop the neo-Nazi movement. It's raging. It's more popular than ever. What it did is it made them feel like victims. It forced them underground. And so you have bizarre cases like a guy who was arrested for having a Hitler ringtone on his phone. That's not going to stop fascism. The question is, even with good intentions, it didn't work. You look at these films of thousands and thousands of neo-Nazis marching through Germany. So it's proof that speech has a way of getting out. Bad speech has a way of getting out. The best disinfectant is good speech. And by the way, forcing these people underground actually makes life more difficult for the government, because it's easier when you allow them to speak. You can see where they are, who they are, what they're saying. So this is a bad policy all around, in my view.
Okay, do you have any comment to make on the Julian Assange case?
Well, I have to first acknowledge that I was called in as an expert on the Julian Assange case. And so they filed recently a long declaration from me on the defense side of Assange. Before I did that, I said that Assange, in my view, is one of the most important cases of the free press in history. If he is extradited to the United States, we are going to have one of the most consequential cases in our history. I do not see the distinction on many levels between what Assange and WikiLeaks was doing and what journalists do. Journalists publish classified information from sources and whistleblowers. Often that information is acquired illegally. That's the point of classified information. They make a decision of what to release. Now, there's grounds where you can criticize Assange to the degree he might have assisted in that, or the degree to which they released this information willy-nilly. But the fact is that if you criminalize what he did, you would criminalize some of the most famous and important journalistic chapters in our history, from Deep Throat and Watergate to the XYZ affair at the beginning of the country.
Okay, the final question doesn't really relate to anything you said, so if you decline to answer it, I'd be totally understanding. But it says, will John Durham be able to finish his investigation before his power is curtailed? If so, how much adverse impact will his indictments have on Biden and some of his top officials?
Well, I think that he will be able to finish the investigation. His budget was just approved for another year a couple of weeks ago. He's also not someone who you want to try to pull the plug on. He's considered a dogged prosecutor. He's widely credited with being apolitical. He's already, as you know, we have an indictment just recently against Sussman, who was a partner at Perkins Coie. And that indictment really shed light on what information Durham has, including the fact that in Perkins Coie, this large law firm, you had Sussman, but you also had Mark Elias, who was often associated with the Steele dossier. Both of them are accused of hiding the funding of the dossier and the role of the Clinton campaign in these Russian allegations, these conspiracy theories. I think Durham is pursuing that aggressively. What concerns me is that you have the Durham investigation. You also have the investigation of Hunter Biden going on into money laundering and possible tax violations. I've written a couple columns saying I don't see how Attorney General Merrick Garland can avoid appointing a special counsel at this point. Some of the information that has come out refer to a commingling of funds from some of these influence peddling operations, at least what many of us view as influence peddling. Some of the same accounts were used to pay bills for now President Biden. I don't see how you could investigate the Hunter Biden case, which is being investigated, without stumbling over the President of the United States. So I'm a little concerned that Merrick Garland has not appointed a special counsel. A special counsel, after all, was appointed by Trump's attorney generals to avoid this type of appearance.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Jonathan, for taking the time to share your insights with us and your wisdom with us. We're very honored and very appreciative.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
All right, and we'll look forward to having you all next week. Thanks for tuning in. Again, all these talks are recorded online and on our website, fff.org. And next week, we'll have Judge Andrew Napolitano, who I'm sure most, if not all of you, are very familiar with. And you're in store for another great talk. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your great support of FFF, and we'll see you next week.